He bought a pregnant stranger for $4. What she whispered made him a father forever. Dust moved like breath across the auction yard, thin as a ghost's whisper, lifting the hems of worn skirts and the edges of old men's hats. The wind smelled of sweat and rust and unspoken things, of horses tied too long and lives sold too cheap. And beneath it all, that iron tang of dust, desert-born, sky-baked, unforgiving. Micah stood near the fence post, thumb hooked through the worn strap of his saddlebag. He didn't come for a woman. Didn't come for much of anything. Just needed seed for the spring, and maybe a few iron nails for the gate that kept giving up. But the wagon had pulled in from the east, wheels rattling like old bones, and when it stopped, folks gathered like crows around the carcass. Inside the wagon bed, huddled among crates and a rusted pot-bellied stove, sat 3 women. Or maybe 4, hard to tell beneath the sackcloth hoods tied over their heads. Their hands were bare, their silence louder than any protest. One girl coughed. Another blinked slow, like she wasn't sure she was still in her skin. "Startin' bid, $2, barked the man with the ledger, voice slick with whiskey and something cruel. "She's got good teeth. Strong hips. Carryin' well. Belly says she's nearin' month 7. The sackcloth turned slightly, just enough to show the bump of her belly pressing against a faded calico dress. Someone laughed. Another spat. And a voice, young jeering, called out, "Ain't no man dumb enough to buy that kind of trouble." Micah didn't move. Didn't look around to see who said it. He was looking at her shoes, cracked leather, toes worn through. Someone once took time to stitch a faded rose at the hem of her dress. A foolish, pretty thing. She hadn't stitched it for herself. $2.50. The words were out of his mouth before he realized he'd spoken. The crowd turned. The auctioneer squinted. 3. Micah didn't blink. 4. Silence dropped like a stone in a still pond. The man gave a shrug. "For it is. Cash only." Micah stepped forward, peeled the crumpled bills from his coat, handed them over without looking at the man. The girl stood slowly, knees trembling. She climbed down from the wagon herself, careful, deliberate. The crowd began to thin, disappointed in the lack of spectacle. Some still watched, waiting for something more than kindness to show itself. He waited until she stood before him, sack still over her head. Then, without ceremony, he reached up and untied the cord beneath her chin. The cloth fell. She was younger than he'd expected, 25, maybe less, but her eyes were older. Not with years, but miles. Sun had kissed her skin unevenly, wind had braided her hair into knots the color of ash. Her lips were chapped. Her hands, he noticed, were not trembling. She looked him square in the chest. "I'll work," she said, voice dry and steady. "I won't beg." Micah didn't speak, just nodded once, like a man acknowledging a sunrise. He led her to his horse, untethered the reins. She didn't wait to be helped up, but she moved slow, testing her balance as if the weight in her belly had betrayed her before. He mounted behind her, not touching her waist, letting the space stretch long and silent between them. The horse turned for home. They rode without words, the sun slipping behind them, washing the road in honey gold and lavender shadows. Sagebrush rolled like waves along the prairie, and fence posts came and went like tired sentinels. Micah's cabin sat nestled against a low ridge of pines, smoke rising from its chimney like a thread being pulled heavenward. The porch creaked as they approached. She dismounted without help. Micah opened the door, stepped aside. She entered like someone stepping into someone else's dream, cautious, reverent. The floor groaned beneath her weight. There was no luxury to be found, just a hearth, a table, one bed against the far wall. A wooden cradle sat beside it, empty and long unused. Dust had gathered there like grief. He pointed to the small chair by the fire. She sat, arms folded over her belly, not for protection but for warmth. "Name's Micah." She looked at the fire, then at the cradle. "Annie," she said after a long pause. He nodded, took a kettle from the hook, and poured water into a cracked mug. Handed it to her. She took it, both hands wrapped around the heat. She didn't ask about his past, and he didn't ask about hers. But grief has a scent, and they both recognized it on the other, like smoke that lingers in a burned-out house. She slept that night on the bed. He took the floor near the fire, his coat rolled beneath his head. In the hush before dawn, when the wind rattled the windows like distant knocking, he heard her whisper, in sleep. Just one word. "Mama." He didn't move, just stared at the ceiling, and let the sound settle in his chest like a stone. By morning, She had cleaned the hearth and swept the corners with a straw broom she found behind the shed. Eggs were warming by the fire, and she was feeding chickens when he stepped outside. She didn't greet him, just off her nod, and kept on with her work. The days found rhythm. She rose early, moved slow but steady, cleaned without being asked. Micah brought wood and water, sharpened tools, patched the leaking roof. They ate in silence most nights, sometimes trading stories without names or dates. She never mentioned the father of the child. He never asked. But once, she winced as she sat, and he offered a folded blanket for the chair. "You stitch this?" he asked, nodding at the calico dress. She glanced down, then away. Mama did, before she passed. He didn't press further. She didn't offer more. The snow came early that year, dusting the hills like sugar over bread. Annie's belly swelled until she moved with both hands beneath it, balancing herself as though walking a tightrope between two lives. One evening, as the wind howled like wolves down the ridge, she stood by the window and stared out for so long he worried she'd forgotten where she was. "You cold?" he asked. She shook her head. "No, just remembering." He didn't ask what. Instead, he took a scrap of wood and began carving, slow, careful cuts, until the shape of a horse began to form. He wasn't sure why. Maybe because it was the kind of gift you give a child you've never met. That night, she woke screaming. Micah rose without sound, blanket in hand. He didn't touch her, just laid the blanket over her shoulders and crouched by the hearth to stoke the fire. She sat there, shaking, face in her hands. When she finally looked up, her eyes were wet, but there was no shame in them. Only fatigue. "You got ghosts too?" she asked. He nodded. "Too many." "I see mine when I sleep," she whispered. "I see mine when I'm awake." They didn't speak again, but when she finally lay back down, she didn't pull the blanket off her shoulders. The days passed like pages turning slowly in a well-loved book. Small things changed. He built her a stool for the kitchen. She hemmed his shirt where the thread had loosened. He showed her how to mend the fence. She showed him how to braid bread with honey inside. But the most important change happened without words. He found himself listening for her steps in the morning. She found herself watching his hands as he chopped wood. They both learned to leave space for silence, not because they feared the words, but because they no longer needed them to feel understood. One afternoon, she stood in the doorway watching the snow fall, hand resting on her belly like she was shielding the child from the world outside. "Why'd you buy me?" she asked quiet. He didn't look up from a horse he was carving. "Didn't feel right, leaving you there." She turned back to the snow. "Didn't feel right standing there." That night, he placed the carved horse on the mantel. She touched it gently, eyes soft. "You think he'll make it?" she asked. "I do." She looked at him then, not past him, not through him, but at him, like seeing a thing she'd known only in dreams. "You always this kind?" she asked. He thought for a moment. "Only since you came." She turned away before he could see her tears. When she finally went to sleep, Micah sat by the fire, the quiet ticking of the clock, the only sound. He looked at the cradle, then at the door, then at the woman asleep in the bed meant for ghosts. "You ain't alone no more," he whispered. And for the first time in years, the cabin felt like a home, not a memory. The wind outside kept blowing, but inside, something sacred had taken root, quiet and slow, like a seed waiting for spring. The thaw came slow, as if winter hadn't yet made peace with letting go. Icicles wept into puddles, and dirt roads turned to rivers. Annie's belly ripened, round and taut, moving sometimes invisible ripples like wind over wheat. Micah built a small bench by the porch, facing morning sun, and she sat there each day with her hands folded over her middle, eyes following birds returning north. The silence between them had grown soft, comfortable, sometimes filled with murmured thoughts or shared looks that said more than conversation ever could. He carved another horse, this one with a broken ear. She didn't ask why it wasn't perfect. She just placed it beside the first on the mantel, like it belonged. One afternoon, they rode into town for supplies, flour, lamp oil, salt. Annie insisted on coming, said she needed air. Her dress was clean, mended, her hair braided loosely, resting over one shoulder. She walked slow but proud, chin lifted like someone who refused to be seen small again. The townsfolk watched, some with curiosity, some with narrowed eyes. One woman whispered to another. An old man at the feed store frowned as they passed. And just outside the mercantile, a girl no older than 16, all ribbons and lace, looked Annie up and down and muttered, "Shameful, really." Annie froze. Micah stepped beside her, not shielding, just standing near enough to matter. He didn't glare, didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at the girl until her face dropped, and she turned away without another word. Back in the wagon, Annie was quiet. The road jostled them in silence. Finally she said, "You don't have to defend me." "I know," Micah answered. "Just don't leave me." His hand tightened around the reins. "Would have left long ago, if that's what I meant to do." The air between them warmed again. That night, as she folded laundry by the fire, she found a pair of small socks tucked into the bottom of the bag Micah had packed. They were made of thick wool, hand-stitched, no tag, no store mark. She held them up with trembling fingers. "Did you make these?" He didn't answer right away, just kept whittling something small in his lap. Then he nodded once. "Tried." She folded them carefully, as if they were a prayer. Spring bled into early summer. Trees bloomed with cautious green, and the soil turned dark and rich. Annie helped plant the beans. She sang softly to herself as she dug, melodies without words, and sometimes the baby kicked in rhythm to her voice. One evening a rider came. Tall, thin, hat pulled low. Dust clung to his coat like a second skin. Annie stepped out onto the porch before Micah could reach the door. Her body stiffened. "Wade," she said, voice flat. Micah joined her, one hand resting lightly against the frame. Wade dismounted slow, grinning in that careless way of men who believe they'll always be welcome somewhere, even after the damage is done. "Well, hell," he said. "Ain't you living the dream?" She didn't speak. He looked at Micah, then back to Annie. "Come to collect what's mine." Micah didn't move. Neither did Annie. "She ain't yours," Micah said. Wade laughed, full of teeth. "She's my blood. Always has been. Mama and Papa left me in charge. I ain't here to fight, but I will if I got to. That kid in there's got my blood too. I want him born in the family name." Annie stepped down the porch steps. Her hands were clenched, but she didn't shake. She stood beside Micah like a pillar made of scars and hard-earned quiet. "You sold me for $4, she said. "That ain't blood. That's abandonment." Wade shifted. Times were hard. "So are we," Micah said. "And yet here we are." For a long moment no one spoke. Then Wade's grin cracked. "You're gonna regret this. You think you're some hero. You ain't nothing. You'll see." Micah didn't blink. "You're not welcome here." Wade spat in the dirt, mounted his horse, and rode off in a cloud of dust and wasted breath. That night, Annie stood by the window long after the lanterns were blown out. Micah didn't sleep. He sat on the edge of the bedroll by the hearth, watching her silhouette against the pale light of the moon. "You scared he'll come back?" he asked. "No. You should be." She turned then, slow and full of something ancient. "He doesn't scare me. Being unloved does. Being unwanted. But not him." Micah rose, walked to her. "Not close, just enough. You're not unwanted." She looked up at him. "I know that now." Then, barely above a whisper, "And it ain't just the child that changed that." He looked down at her hand resting on the windowsill. His fingers brushed hers, tentative, trembling like branches meeting in the wind. The storms came just days later. Dark clouds stacked on the ridge, like judgment. Thunder groaned low and long across the valley. Micah secured the windows, gathered buckets, braced the barn doors. Annie tried to help, but her breath came sharp and shallow. That night, as the rain roared against the roof and the chimney howled like a voice from another world, Annie gripped the table, her knees giving way. "It's time," she said. Micah had never delivered a child, but grief had taught him steadiness. He boiled water, tore cloth, lit the lamps. She labored with quiet moans, sweat rolling down her temples, her hands gripping his shirt, then his wrist, then nothing at all. The hours passed like seasons, and when the first cry split the thunder, it sounded like a miracle. He was small and red-faced and furious. Alive. Annie held him to her chest, weeping, without shame. Micah sat beside her, hands still clutching the blanket he didn't know how to wrap. She looked at the child, then up at him. "Isaac," she said. "It means laughter." He smiled faintly. "You Logan now?" She nodded, tears falling. "I never thought I would again." Micah rose and threw another log on the fire. The warmth crackled across the room. Later, she sat up in bed, the baby swaddled at her side. She watched Micah tend the fire like it was something sacred. "You don't have to keep us," she said softly. "I'll leave when I'm strong enough. Won't make trouble." He turned then, walked slowly over to the bed, and knelt beside her. "You think that's what this is? A debt? Something owed?" She didn't answer. He took her hand, rough, scarred, honest, and placed it over his chest. "This house ain't been a home in years. You didn't just bring a child. You brought breath back into these walls." Her lips trembled. "I ain't just asking you to stay," he said, voice thick, deep like earth. "I'm tellin' you this house'll never be whole without you in it." She leaned into him, resting her head against his shoulder, her breath soft and steady now. The baby cooed. Micah wrapped his arm around both of them, slow and reverent, like a man touching grace for the first time. Outside, the storm passed. The land exhaled. Trees dripped quietly, and the sky opened into stars. If this tale touched your heart, ride along with us for more. Subscribe for soulful Wild West stories told from the firelight.